I would try to put aside my indignance and my general disdain for the administration. And something I've struggled with my whole life is the difference between being right and being effective. And if you have audience with the most powerful person in the world, you'd like to take advantage of that opportunity to try and get something done or influence him on what could potentially be a powerful public policy. First off, the majority of my recommendations would be non-starters because the president's policies and view of the world is just so counter to mine. So I would try and find something where there was common ground that I think he would be receptive to, that he might pick up and run with. And the one thing that comes to mind for me, what I would advocate for if I had 5 minutes with the president, would be mandatory national service. I think that there's so many young people who come out of high school who aren't quite ready for college, are a little bit lost, and that young people would very much benefit from 1 or 2 years of serving in the agency of something bigger than themselves, shoulder to shoulder with people from different ethnic, economic, sexual orientation backgrounds, different geographies. I think they would really enjoy it. I think if the program was well run, and it could be everything from military service to working at a no-kill dog shelter to being a smoke jumper to working in a national park to senior care, health care. I think the best thing we could do, or one of the best things we could do for young Americans right now, is to show them how wonderful other Americans are and try and restore some of the connective tissue between Americans. 1 out of 2 people my age feel good or great about America. It's only 1 in 10 young people. And I think a way to create connective tissue would be national service. And I think we need to move back to the 50s and 60s where people didn't look at everything through the lens of their identity, that they saw themselves as Americans first. And one of the reasons there was so much great legislation in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Great Society, civil rights, et cetera, women's rights, is that many of the people, or most of the people actually, elected representatives had served in the same uniform. They saw themselves as Americans first. Anyways, I would try to do something where I thought I had a chance of highlighting something that he might get passionate about and carry forward. And I think that probably that one thing would be mandatory national service. So I think that would be great for our young men and women in Israel, and they have mandatory national service, and they have some of the lowest levels of young adult depression. They find friends, mentors, and mates in the IDF. They say, hey, Prof G, my question is how to avoid burnout. I'm a partner of a small company that's been growing pretty rapidly the last few months, and I haven't had a single day off since September 1st, and I'm writing this on November 3rd. Some days are shorter, but I've also had days that are 12 hours or longer. It's causing me to fall behind in my personal life, whether it's not being able to get basic chores done, not getting to the gym as much, or not seeing friends or dating. I feel the work I'm doing is good and it's showing results, but I wanted to ask if there's anything you do in particular, because I'm guessing you felt burned out before. I was very economically motivated for the first, 25 years of my professional career. I didn't grow up with a lot of money, and it's always been a goal of mine to be economically secure in the one thing in my control. The market trumps individual performance, so you can be really smart, work really hard, and not end up doing that well. You can also be just okay and end up doing really well, because a lot of it is luck. Can you do really well if you don't work that hard? Yeah, probably not. Anyways, my point is it comes at a cost. So the first is to forgive yourself and realize that if you're really committed to driving your agency and having to be number one, just burnout at some point or just sheer exhaustion is just going to be part of the journey. I'm not suggesting that you accept that and accept a life of drudgery. What I do to try and restore myself is I always try to make space, take time for family. Is that true? Actually, no, it's not true. For fucking 20 years, I did nothing but work. What gives me energy is exercise. Once I had boys, spending time with family, that crowded out a lot of time with friends and a lot of quote-unquote extracurricular stuff. The hacks aren't that exotic. Try and prioritize sleep. Try and make sure you get at least 7 hours. And for me, my kind of ultimate hack has always been fitness. If I can work out, I feel as if I get the hour back. If I spend an hour working out, and now I spend only 20 or 30 minutes, I do these kind of high intensity workouts for 20 or 30 minutes, I find that I get that time back because I'm more productive, I have more energy, and in general, it's like a freebie. It might cost me 20 or 30 minutes, but I'm at least a half an hour more productive, easier time getting to sleep. I want to eat better, happier, more productive. And then, look, the ultimate hack is the following. If you're at an agency and you're working that hard, I don't think there's a way to avoid it in the beginning. But the only way an agency scales and the only way you're going to have some semblance of a life, at some point, your ability to grow your agency and be economically secure without killing yourself is going to be a function of finding good people and then making them owners, paying them well, giving them both economic and psychological compensation such that they stay with you and help scale you in this company. That's kind of the whole shooting match. And that is, people think I work much harder than I do. I do go in spurts. I do have periods where I work pretty hard. I'm very productive. But I don't work as hard as people think. They see all the content that we put out here at Prof G and think, wow, you must work around the clock. I don't. What I do is that I'm able to attract and retain really talented people that help scale my efforts such that I have a lot of balance in my life. I take a lot of vacation because I have attracted really good people who are able to leverage the 40 to 50 hours I work a week. And sometimes it's 30 to 40. It used to be 60 to 70, and I'm not sure there's a way to avoid that if you're very ambitious when you're young. In sum, try and prioritize sleep. Make sure you get at least 7 hours. See if you can carve out a half an hour a day for exercise. Forgive yourself, recognizing that you're going to be stressed. You're going to have to work hard in a competitive economy if you're ambitious. But over time, the superpower to being both economically successful and having some balance in your life comes down to one word: others. We'll be right back. I thought at some point I'd really like to be a teacher. Initially, I thought I wanted to make a bunch of money and then go back and be a substitute teacher in math in high school. And then I realized that's real work, putting up with high school students all day. And I thought, okay, maybe I'd like to be a professor. So I gave myself 10 years to make some money, and then I thought I'm going to try and go be a professor. And I did that. Almost exactly 10 years after I graduated from business school, I got a job as an adjunct at NYU, and I went from adjunct to associate lecturer to clinical associate to associate clinical to clinical, and now they just call me professor of marketing. And academia promotions, they take titles away from you and at some point just call you a professor of marketing. It has been exceptional. I'll give you the upsides and downsides, for me at least. It is really a wonderful attribute of our society that you take a very, very narrow part of the world and try and understand everything about it. And your job is to be one of the top thought leaders or teachers in that field. And your job is to try and damage young people's muscle in between their ears such that it grows back stronger and they become more critical thinkers and can provide economic security for them and their families and add to society. It's just a wonderful component of a modern society. Campus environment is wonderful. It's really nice to be around young people. I've had about 4,500 students. I generally can't go more than 2 or 3 days in New York without someone coming up to me and saying, hey, I was in brand strategy fall 2007, and they're lovely and nice people, and it's interesting to hear what they've been up to. You know, it calls on some really wonderful kind of paternal instincts. You do learn a lot about the subject matter, because if you're talking about search in a class, and I might have 3 or 4 kids in my class that work at Google because I teach second year MBAs and some of them are part-time. So you have to bring it. You can't just show up and start telling war stories. You have to actually learn about the shit. I mean, there's something to be said that the teacher is just the best student in the class. The environment is really nice. I've made some wonderful friends at NYU. There's some really outstanding people there. And also, it's been an amazing platform. I'm not sure people would pay me what they pay me for my books and my talks, or take me as seriously and be as inclined to give me the benefit of the doubt on the things I'm saying. I kind of have an open heart and an open mind when I say stuff if it didn't say NYU professor after my title. Right now, I'm that provocative, obnoxious professor. Without that, I would just be provocative and obnoxious, and I'm not sure my career would have had the traction it's had. Also, the focus on data and academic integrity has informed me. I do catch myself saying things and thinking, okay, before I say this, I need to find out if, in fact, this data is correct. I do fact check myself a lot more than I would otherwise, because I take the responsibility to kind of academic integrity and rigor pretty seriously. In my most recent book, Notes on Being a Man, I've got 15 pages of research notes and citations. So that's been helpful to me. It's been a tremendous platform. It's also, I think, a pretty good career for people. Unfortunately, there's too many old people who won't leave, like Congress, and so there's not as much opportunity for young people who might be more talented than that 75-year-old professor of you name it who refuses to leave because of tenure. I think it's an outstanding way to make a living. And you get a lot of freedom in terms of your time. You get to be around a great environment, great students. So those are the upsides. What are the downsides? I have found that the moment I leave the classroom and I'm on campus or in the department, that my career went sideways or down. And that is the administrative state of universities, the politics are just total negative value. that the people who end up in administration and the environment outside of a classroom is unproductive, not cutthroat, but fairly, like, I think it was Kissinger that said, why is academia so cutthroat? Because there's so little at stake. And I found that my career absolutely took off when I would do nothing on campus but teach, and then I would leave. I think I work with one of the best faculties in the world, but a third of them should be put on an ice flow. I think this construct of tenure makes sense in certain departments. It makes no sense in a business school. It just results in massive bloat and people who aren't pulling their weight. So we make them department chairs or administrators so that they can wreak havoc at a leadership level. You're never going to find the range of talent you're going to find in a university. There are literally some of the most talented people in the world. And then some of the least talented, terrible managers, obstructive, just the range of the quality. You'll never find a greater range than on the faculty of an elite school. Some of the most impressive and some of the least impressive people you'll ever meet in the same building. And I found that, I don't know if frustrating is the right word. I'll just say it. As soon as I left campus, unless I was teaching, my career just took off and focused on other environments. And maybe that just means I don't have the skills to be successful in kind of the academic environment. But it's a wonderful career, I think, for somebody who's interested, who's a bit of a lone wolf, likes their own schedule, and wants to be an expert in a topic and use it as a platform to develop thought leadership, credibility, and also income streams. I don't think any business school professor is that good unless they're making seven figures. And 15, 20% of that will come from the school. But if you're really good at what you do, you should be getting all sorts of offers for books, speaking gigs, consulting gigs, and you might turn it down. But for God's sakes, the business school, if you're good at what you do, you should have all sorts of opportunities. And I think that's true across different departments too. Heather Cox Richardson is I think a history professor, and I'm pretty sure she makes 10 or 15 million bucks a year on her Substack. Now, again, money isn't the only metric here, but I think it's a tremendous platform to develop other means of economic security. But the administrative state, the bloat, sometimes I think we're not having our feet held to the fire of what I'd call competitive market dynamics leads to a lot of energy that goes into things that are totally irrelevant, with people pushing paper to each other. So it's a mixed bag, but on the whole, I would say it's a great career for young people, and it's been remarkable for me. I've carried an NYU business card, I'm just saying metaphorically, for 23 years now, and I've never liked to be associated or affiliated with anything for longer than 10 years. At the end of the day, what do I do? When people ask me, I teach. And I think it's incredibly rewarding on a lot of levels. But yeah, it's a mixed bag. A bit of a word salad there, but it's a mixed bag. But on the whole, I think it's an outstanding way to spend your,
Filtering into the chip names, but then clearly over the last month or so, you've seen myriad deals announced, NVIDIA, AMD, etc. And so, that it sort of come down one layer. And yet still, when you're getting down into the actual supply chain where these chips are going to be built, you're not yet seeing the orders. So Jensen Huang, Sam Altman walking around talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth of chips. And yet there's ASML today reporting 5 billion euros worth of orders. As I said at the start, it's healthy, but it's not record levels by any means. So and they got a lot of questions on this, the management team, during the conference call this afternoon. And visibility is improving. They're clearly having those conversations through the supply chain with their customers and the customers, but it's not yet materializing orders. Something that I do think has to come in the next few quarters. Otherwise, the fantastic numbers in terms of chips that are being talked about, the number of data centers, the lead times in this industry mean that it's going to be harder and harder to achieve those on time if we don't start to see the orders flow through.
The other concern that was mentioned on the call was China. The CEO mentioned that there was perhaps going to be a dip in Chinese demand and therefore Chinese revenue. Could you speak to what we learned about ASML and the relationship with China?
Sure. China has been a strong revenue driver for them for the last few years. It's true for the entire semiconductor equipment space as China has been building out their capacity. And there has also been a regular refrain from the equipment industry, ASML included, at least over the last year, that the Chinese revenue would start to decline, in some cases quite meaningfully. And when we started 2025, ASML was saying they expected between 20 and 25% of revenue to come from China this year. As we came through the first couple of quarters, they were doing a bit better than that, 27% through the first half. And so they were saying, look, it's probably a bit above 25. And then in the quarter they just reported this morning, as 42% of their hardware sales in the quarter. So it really stepped up materially. And so, I think it's probably going to be north of 30% by the time fourth quarter is said and done. So still a very strong year from China. And therefore, they're again saying, look, we don't think that it is a sustainable level, probably comes back into the low to mid 20% range over the long term. So they're sticking to that message, even while in the near term, they're continuing to ship more than they had anticipated. So the demand is there. It's certainly not slowing down.
I'm so struck by the tone of ASML. I compare it to the very hyped up AI stocks and Tesla. I mean, I'm just looking at the net bookings doubling and seeing all of this growth in China. And yet the tone is, again, we're worried about this. It could come down. Don't get too excited, which is very interesting, especially when you look at the stock, which is up, 30% over the past couple of months.
Yeah, indeed. It's had a dramatic turn. I'd say in talking to investors in the July and August timeframe after second quarter results, people would engage, but you were struggling to get commitment. There was a sense that either numbers needed to come lower for those who were most bearish at the time for 2026, or even if they believed the numbers, they wanted their hand held a little bit and wanted to speak to management, wanted to understand what was going on. There was just a lack of conviction. And all of that changed very rapidly. I mean, even by semiconductor standards during the month of September. And I think it was just sort of the news flow was just building day after day after day in terms of these deals that were being talked about in the AI space. And also the memory market, pricing in DRAM really had started to turn positively. And the combination of those things, finally gave the market that conviction. It's like, okay, the industry data points are telling me 2026 shouldn't get any worse than is modeled. And so I'm going to, as a market, I'm going to feel more comfortable in buying this stock and indeed this group. And that's essentially what ASML have confirmed this morning, right? 2026 has been reset to an achievable level, and we can now look forward to growth in 2027 and beyond.
All right. Andrew Gardner, Head of European Technology Equity Research at Citi. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
So, strong quarter for ASML. And if you are a regular listener to the show, then perhaps you saw this coming. Perhaps you even own the stock because, yes, we did predict this. Back in July when we last discussed ASML, we said the stock was on sale. We said that ASML was a buy. Our conclusion here is that we might have some dislocation on our hands. And as a result, we think this is probably a buying opportunity. Our thesis is that ASML just got put up for sale. As of market close on Wednesday, July 16th, yesterday, it is 8% off on ASML. And for no other reason other than the CEO is buying into the tariff drama while the rest of America isn't. And that to us spells buying opportunity. That was July 17th. The stock was trading at around $740 per share at the time. Today, it is trading at over $1,000 per share. So our prediction was correct. Indeed, we did see taco. The tariffs did not impact the earnings, and the stock in the past 3 months has risen 35%, one of the best performing stocks in Q3. And it is also now the most valuable public company in Europe, $390 billion market cap. It is now ahead of LVMH, which is at $350 billion, and also ahead of Novo Nordisk at $250 billion. So good call there. At this point, we think the company is pretty much fairly valued. In other words, we don't see the kind of upside that we saw 3 months ago. But at the same time, this is still a very strong company, strong moats, very well positioned in AI, and it has not been subject to the same hype that we have seen with many of these other. Hinted about bringing podcasters onto the platform a few months ago. We actually discussed what that might look like back in April.
Netflix will overnight be able to they'll own a bunch of podcasts. They might start early by just being a distribution platform, learning about it, making some ad revenue. And then they will go vertical and either launch their own or buy some. And they will make, I would bet within 24 to 36 months, 3 of the 10 biggest podcasts in the world are owned by Netflix.
And now it appears that they are indeed going ahead with it. We will see podcasts on Netflix. Let's give Scott Galloway a call. Let's see what he makes of this move. Scott, good to see you.
Good to be seen, Ed. What's going on?
Not much. I see you are outside the pub. Are we interrupting something?
So, Ed, I'm here at a classic British pub, which means I have American tourists in town. It's like when you live in New York, the only time you go to Broadway is when tourists or your mom's in town and they force you to go to Broadway. I would much rather be at a douchey LA-like members club, but I've been dragged to one of these British pubs with my LA friends. Anyways, here we are.
Here we are. We want to get your reaction to this new move from Netflix. They are getting into podcasting officially. We talked about this a few months ago, how that might be happening. Now we know for sure Netflix is getting into podcasting. Your reactions of what that might mean for the podcasting industry?
Well, we predicted this. What this is that it's squarely an indication that Netflix recognizes that their biggest competitor isn't Hulu or Disney Plus. Their biggest competitor is YouTube. And YouTube is now the largest distribution platform for podcasts. 25% of the people who listen to this podcast will watch it on a TV, streaming it off of YouTube. So they recognize that they need to be in that game. This is, and in addition, podcasts are the fastest growing ad-supported medium in the world. Alphabet grew, I think, 13%. I think Meta was 16%. Podcast ad revenue was up 18%. Now, granted, that's up off a much smaller base, but there really isn't a medium that's growing faster than podcasts. So this just makes all the sense in the world. I think we predicted this about 6 months ago. I'm shocked it took this long.
One thing is kind of interesting. These are exclusive deals. So basically when the podcast gets added to Netflix and Spotify, by the way, it's a partnership, the episode is taken off of YouTube. So you have to kind of choose. Any reactions to the way they're structuring that?
Well, again, above, see above, they see YouTube as their competitor. So Netflix is flexing their muscles and says, well, that's about 40 empty bottles of Guinness right there. So look, Netflix is flexing their muscles. They're like, we could be and should be the largest distribution platform for podcasts, or could be. We can put you in front of 150 million eyeballs on the home screen. The home screen for Netflix is, maybe with the exception of the home screen on Instagram or the Google query box, is the most valuable real estate in the world. And so they've said, look, if you want to have a shot of being a featured podcast, you can't be on YouTube. So, I get it. What they've also done, though, is the content, they're very strategic. They're doing sports, they're doing crime, they want to stay out of politics. I'm shocked they didn't go into business. I called Ted Sarandos about 6 months ago and said, why aren't you in podcasting? And he's an incredibly smart, kind of reeks of class kind of guy. And he said, well, we're thinking about it, we're looking at it. But Netflix could be a kingmaker here. Those podcasts are going to be overnight some of the biggest pods in the world. And in addition, what they're doing here is what Netflix does. What their strategy is their, I call it the Allied World War II strategy. And that is the Allies the Germans had better tanks, better officers, better guns, better planes. But what they didn't have was gasoline. We had 38 gallons of gasoline for every 1 gallon the Allies had. And the Allies basically just overwhelmed the Axis power with gasoline. And Amazon and Netflix basically overwhelmed the competition with capital. And in addition to just more gross tonnage of capital, Netflix produces more for less than anyone in the world in terms of quality of content. And the way they've done that is through these arbitrages. The first was an arbitrage through geography, right? They're essentially producing stuff. Over 50% of their content budget is spent overseas because they can make a film for 70% of what it costs in America and Spain, and maybe less than that in a place like Seoul. And in addition, this is the next arbitrage, and that is a medium arbitrage. So if you look at Prop G, and we've been open about this, our kind of top line is about 15 million, conservatively 20 people, that's 750 grand per employee. Let's look at TV, Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert, 60 million, 200 employees, 300,000 per employee. Comcast, CNBC, all those guys, $200,000 to $300,000 per employee. So effectively, what's happening is they're arbitraging the medium, and what's happening is that essentially podcasts are becoming TV, and TV less slowly is becoming podcasts. And that is, podcasts are essentially TV with a strong audio overlay that are 70 or 80% of the production quality, if they do a good job, of television at 10 to 20% of the price. So Netflix is going to be featuring TV shows that were traditionally known as podcasts that cost 10 or 20% as a similar TV show, but already have a built-in audience. I think this raises the stakes. It's going to increase the production value of podcasts, but essentially podcasts are the new television.
Will Prof G Markets be on Netflix in the next few years?
No, but what we'll likely do, in all seriousness, is we'll likely find distribution. We will find distribution on television. We will take elements of our podcasts, we will cut them up, edit them for television, and then use MSNBC or CNBC or CNN or Netflix as a point of distribution and be able to strike a deal, because the incremental cost to the network of having good quality content will be pretty minimal, and the incremental cost to us for new distribution will be pretty minimal. So, effectively, podcasts are smaller businesses that are much more profitable than traditional television. And that's going to be very attractive. If you've got 2 hours of open space on the weekend for an MSNBC or CNBC, why wouldn't you take the best business or the best politics podcast, edit it for TV, increase the production value, and just split the revenue with the podcast producers? And it's no incremental risk to either party. So you're going to see TV become more like podcasts and podcasts become more like TV. The mediums are converging, but ultimately the two big takeaways here are Netflix and YouTube have opened another front in the war against each other. And this is just arbitraging the means of production to produce content at a lower price, which is what the industry is looking for.
All right, Scott, enjoy your pub dinner. What did you order? Accelerate AI infrastructure spending. So BlackRock, NVIDIA, Microsoft, xAI, they're all teaming up and they're going to buy this company, Aligned Data Centers. For context, this company was last valued in January at $12 billion. 9 months later, we are now at $40 billion. So this is a very rich valuation. It is also a rich valuation when you look at this as a multiple of sales. The company is doing about $1.5 billion in revenue, which would value the company at 25 times sales. That is far higher than Aligned Data Centers competitors like Equinix or DLR. They trade at around 10 times sales. So what are BlackRock and NVIDIA and all these investors, what are they so excited about? Well, it's pretty simple. Data centers are the hot new thing. Everyone wants to build one. Everyone wants to design one. Everyone wants to invest in one. This deal is one of many deals. We have seen roughly 1,500 new data centers announced this year. And in most cases, as with this one, the investors are paying a significant premium to get in on the action. So this is really nothing new. And it got us thinking, especially after our investigations into OpenAI and their spending ambitions, it got us thinking, how realistic is any of this? All of these data centers that we are seeing, is it hype or is it legit? Are we really going to see thousands of data centers? Or are investors getting overexcited about this to the point where it doesn't really make sense? Well, our research lead, Mia Silverio, uncovered some data that we found quite intriguing. And what it tells us is that despite all of the investment that we're seeing that is pouring into these data centers, the data centers themselves are not actually getting built right now. In fact, of all of the data centers that have been announced, only a quarter of them are actually undergoing construction. And this is especially apparent when you look at the earnings of the companies that actually do the building for these data centers. Jacobs Solution, for example, this is the number one company for data center engineering. Their revenue is actually flat. It hasn't grown in 2 years. Fluor Corp, which is one of the top data center construction companies. They actually just reported a 6% decline in their sales and also a 12% decline in their backlog, i.e. the sales they're going to see in the future. So when we look at the data center activity that is happening, yes, a lot of investment, but not a lot of actual building. And then there is this other unanswered question, which is how all of these data centers are going to be powered. How are we going to supply the energy for all of these data centers? The number of interconnection requests, that is the applications that are required to connect these centers to the electric grid, i.e. power them, the number of those requests is currently 10 times higher than the number of data centers that are being built. In other words, the grid is overwhelmed right now, which means that it's not even clear if there's enough power to keep the data centers' lights on, which is why, by the way, these construction timelines to build these data centers, they keep on getting extended out by 4, 5, in some cases even 6 years. It's also why electric costs have doubled in the areas where data centers have been built. There is this mismatch between the supply for the data centers and the demand for the data centers. We keep on seeing all these deals about how all these data centers are going to get built. And then when it comes to actually building the thing, suddenly a lot of doubts come up, a lot of questions arise. And in many cases, these things aren't being built. Now, why is this important? Again, why do we care? Well, because this is a major part of the AI story. And therefore, it is potentially a major part of the AI bubble. We're seeing huge amounts of investment into these data centers and also a huge amount of debt that is being issued to build them. In fact, when you look at the investment-grade debt market, AI is the single largest source of debt in the US right now. There is more debt being issued in AI right now than in the entire financial sector. So in other words, what we're dealing with here isn't just equity risk. It's not just that we might see a wipeout in the values of many of these AI stocks or these AI private companies. We're also now dealing with credit risk. We are looking at the possibility of defaults on these data centers, and it could happen at a very large scale. Now, this isn't to say that the data center boom isn't going to happen. It almost certainly will. But it is to say that this boom, which everyone's very excited about, it's not going to be anywhere near as big as many investors seem to think. When you look at the actual economics of these things, suddenly you start to realize, actually, this stuff doesn't really make sense. And if we had to make a prediction, we would estimate that roughly a third of these data centers that have been announced, roughly a third of them will never actually materialize because the economics just don't work here. So next time you see a big data center headline like this one, these huge multiples, all of these very exciting investors, just remember, take it with a grain of salt. The investors are big, the numbers are sexy, but don't let that distract you from what is actually realistic. You always have to ask yourself, lines. That was largely driven by data center revenue, which rose 75% year over year in the quarter. Revenue projections for the current quarter also came in higher than investors had expected. Nvidia stock rose as much as 5% after hours, but then moderated during the call. Salesforce also reported yesterday, but those earnings had a very different outcome. The company's revenue grew 12% in the fiscal fourth quarter, which was its fastest growth rate in 2 years. However, investors were disappointed with the company's revenue guidance for 2026. That sent the stock down nearly 6% after hours. Joining us to unpack these earnings, we are speaking with Gil Luria, Head of Technology Research at D.A. Davidson. Gil, good to see you. I want to start with NVIDIA here. Another incredible monster quarter. This keeps on happening. Everyone thinks that we're going to see an issue and everyone gets very anxious, and then just an unbelievable quarter. Your initial reactions?
Well, not only is it is unbelievable, the numbers are just getting staggering, especially for a company that's so profitable to be able to grow at these rates continuously. But beyond that, they just said they're going to grow sequentially for the rest of the year. They don't typically give more than one quarter out. So the fact that they have that visibility and talked about that going into calendar 2027 tells you that they have more visibility than ever. Their customers are making longer term commitments than ever. They can see the rollout of the data centers happening at such a rate and with such a backlog that they know that they'll be able to continue to grow from here on out, which is, again, very impressive, especially when the numbers are this big.
What does this mean for the, I don't know if I could call it AI bubble story at this point. The AI anxiety story, maybe we have to call it. I mean, we saw the Citrini research article that came out this week and got everyone very anxious about AI. We've seen just incredible drawdowns in the software sector, again, because of AI. What does this do to the AI story? How are investors thinking about this now that NVIDIA continues to dominate?
Well, there's two different types of anxiety, and they're actually the polar opposite of each other. One level of anxiety is, oh my goodness, we're building so many data centers. This can't be sustainable. When it stops, the music's going to stop. The economy's going to decline. NVIDIA's going to decline. The mega caps, the hyperscalers can't afford to do this. That's one level of anxiety that we've been living with for a few months. The other level of anxiety is the exact opposite. Oh my goodness, AI is so potent, it's going to run us over. It's going to go industry by industry and destroy it. And software stocks are worth nothing at their terminal value. Those two things are opposite. Either you believe AI is great and it's going to transform the economy in 2 years, or you believe that AI isn't that good and we're going to stop building data centers. Those two things are opposite types of anxiety. And we think that, I've lived with a lot of anxiety in my life, but we can take a deep breath and say, both of those things are pretty extreme perspectives. What we do know is that AI is incredibly valuable. It's very potent technology that we are just starting to realize how useful it is to both business customers as well as consumers. Business customers are willing to make long-term commitments, which is why Microsoft, Amazon, and Google are building these data centers, because they have these long-term commitments. And consumers are willing to pay more and more for these subscriptions and using these tools in an even more comprehensive way. We know that's happening. So the anxiety about AI isn't real and we don't need these data centers. NVIDIA can help us put that aside by telling us, look, this data center construction is going to continue. On the anxiety of AI is happening too fast and everybody's going to be unemployed, we can also take a deep breath about that and say, somewhere between software engineers that are very much impacted by AI and nurses that are probably not going to be impacted by AI in decades, we have all the other professions. And yes, AI is going to impact every single profession in that progression, but not all at once. Some professions are more susceptible than others. They will change. The hiring around those will change. People that no longer fit in that profession will move to the other professions. This is not going to happen in a 2-year time frame. Those types of essays are science fiction. They are doomer porn. We can put them aside and just focus on what's in front of us, which is a very powerful technology that could drive productivity growth, which is a good thing. It'll help increase the value of our labor, which will get us paid more. It'll help our companies grow faster so they can hire more. That's the more likely scenario than those extreme concerning scenarios.
I think that the Salesforce earnings is a good sort of foil to the NVIDIA earnings, both coming out the same day, which is a reflection of those AI anxieties that you just brought up there, that AI is going to be so great that it's going to kill all of the legacy companies. I look at these Salesforce earnings, revenue grew 12%. That's very strong. I looked at remaining performance obligations, $35 billion, which was actually higher than expected. The only issue was the revenue guidance for the year, which everyone is saying was a miss, but to me it was a meet. I mean, they said 45.8 to 46.2 billion. Wall Street expected 46 billion. That to me, that sounds like exactly what they said. But shares are tanking, down nearly 6% after hours. What does that earnings tell you about the AI anxiety story? And what do you think of these earnings? Do you think that they are as bad as everyone else seems to think they are?
I think the least of Salesforce's issue is AI. I actually think the issue at Salesforce is that their business is just decelerating rapidly. The growth rate was higher this quarter because they acquired Informatica, which is contributing at least 3 or 4% to that growth rate. So they're already only growing high single digits. Just a couple of years ago, they were growing 15%. It's their business that's decelerating for reasons that have nothing to do with AI. They're losing share to HubSpot and Monday and ServiceNow and Braze and Klaviyo and a whole cottage industry of companies that are providing sales and marketing software that's just better than Salesforce. Having said that, what you're saying is spot on in that the market is going to glop onto this and say, oh my goodness, AI is killing software. It's not. Salesforce is just decelerating and the results are declining. There's been plenty of companies that have reported good results so far this quarter, but their stocks went down anyway because of this negative narrative about software. But in Salesforce's case, it's really about just their core business not doing well.
What do you think about the tension of this AI anxiety right now? You mentioned there's the AI is going to be less impactful than we thought it was going to be, which is why it's a bubble. And so the valuations of everything are going to come down. And then there's the other argument, which is that AI is going to be so powerful that it's going to ruin all of the business models as we know it. Those two forces seem to be in real contention with one another. And I'm struggling to figure out which one is actually the dominant sentiment on Wall Street, which one is actually the right sentiment, which one is crazier than the other. And it's hard to sort of parse out what the price of these stocks are actually telling us at this point, because those are two, as you say, completely opposite stories.
I'd say that we've been living with that first type of anxiety, the data center build out isn't going to get a return for several months. The software anxiety is more recent, but I'd say both are playing out in the market right now and causing a lot of fear. But I would actually posit that maybe that's about something bigger. The fact that investors are so jittery right now is probably an indication that we've had a very long bull run, that there's concerns about the U.S. government and its policies, the geopolitics of our global relationships, our geopolitics of our trade policy that has to change every week now. And so I think the market is jittery. It's looking for bad news. And now we have two opposing but compelling and scary stories that investors are telling themselves that are causing them to knock down stocks. I think that there is that layer of just overall jittery markets based on where we are from an overall macroeconomic and a geopolitical perspective.
My instinct when I see these massive sell-offs is, I think, similar to yours, which is this seems to me an overreaction. This seems to me highly emotional and not nearly grounded in the reality that we're seeing on the ground and the data, not nearly enough. At the same time, I could also see someone saying, you're just sweeping these concerns under the rug. It's convenient for you, especially you, Gil Luria, as someone who's in this industry, to say it's not a big deal. People are overreacting. Things are going to be okay. Look how productive the technology is. What would you say to those people?
But then I'm really not trying to sweep anything under the rug. I'm talking about we all have to make weighted probability decisions about potential outcomes. I'm just saying we're overbuilding data centers is a 10% outcome. The AI is going to run everything over in the next 2 years is a 10% outcome. And there's an 80% outcome that neither of those terrible things is going to happen. And if that's the case, we need to look at what the investable opportunities are. So one of them is NVIDIA, trading at 25 times when AMD and Broadcom are trading at 32 times with not as good of a business. Software, which for years traded on revenue multiples, which was always ridiculous. What does it even mean to be 6 times revenue or 8 times revenue? That means nothing. Shareholders only get cash flows. The value of a company is only the value of their future cash flows. All of a sudden, we're looking at this big universe of software companies on a cash flow basis, on an earnings basis. We have Microsoft at 20 times cash flow. We have ServiceNow and Dynatrace and Adobe trading at less than 20 times earnings or cash flow. And we have super hyper growth companies like Snowflake and Datadog and Shopify trading at maybe 35 times cash flow. So those are actual real opportunities that the market has created because of the extreme scenarios. But I don't want to sweep them under the rug. They are potential scenarios. I'm just taking the weighted probability and saying, I think there's 80% right up the middle that we're going to be fine, that AI enhances productivity in a way that makes software companies better, especially winners in software. Not every software company. There'll be plenty of software companies that fail, but the good ones will win, and those are more attractive.
Is, quote, plummeting. It's not true, and incomes are rising fast. Trump also touched on new initiatives, including the Trump investment accounts and a pledge to make big tech cover its own electricity needs. While domestic issues dominated the speech, Trump did briefly touch on foreign policy as well. He claimed that he's ended 8 wars and warned that Iran is rebuilding its nuclear weapons program. He also briefly acknowledged the, quote, unfortunate ruling from the Supreme Court that deemed the tariffs illegal. Earlier that day, his new 10% global tariff rate officially went into effect. So, here to discuss the State of the Union, we're speaking with Ian Bremmer, founder and president of Eurasia Group. Ian, thank you for joining us on Prof G Markets.
My pleasure.
So, this State of the Union, Trump spoke for a record 107 minutes. Lots to unpack here. Let's just start with your initial reactions. What stood out to you?
I had 108 minutes, but I mean, we might have started and stopped the timers at different points. You never know. It was very long. And there wasn't much new there. I mean, there was a surprise that a high-level member of the Venezuelan opposition and someone that would be credible in a democratically elected government released and then surprised right there, introduced to his family right there in the Capitol building. That was a pretty big deal, frankly. I mean, it wasn't just cinematic. It is an actual success of the Trump administration, and it's a success for an attack against an authoritarian regime. There's like forces of liberty and freedom. This is the kind of thing that any American president, if they had done, you would say, good on them. So, and yeah, I got to be excited about having the American hockey team win the gold. I remember being in Vancouver for the gold medal match back when the Americans and the Canadians liked each other. And it was one of the most exciting sporting events I've ever been to in my life. I don't even like hockey, but everyone was so excited to be there. And frankly, the Americans were pretty happy for the Canadians were there because they're more excited about hockey at the end of the day. But it was great to see them come home after that extraordinary overtime win that could have easily gone the other way. And there they were, and excited, and they're athletes first and foremost, and they're flying the flag, and they're proud to be Americans, and everyone was cheering them, and that was great to see. But I mean, I'm obviously starting with the good moments, right? Because after that, there wasn't a lot. There wasn't a lot. The economy is not doing well. Trump cannot will it so. This is Prof G Markets. You know that. The average American is not happy about where the economy is. Trump is underwater on that. He didn't mention Epstein, even though it's been what we've been talking about for weeks now. Larry Summers is being forced out of Harvard. He clearly did not want to go. He was kicking and screaming. There are a lot of Democrats that are getting in trouble. So why is it that Trump is actually not saying a word about this? And it's because it's a two-tier judicial system, and he's protecting himself. He's protecting his members of his cabinet, his friends, and that's clearly unpopular for him too. And there are only so many more months to go before midterm elections. And if those elections were today, the Republicans would get thumped pretty badly, and he knows it. He knows it. So this was not an easy speech to give. For someone who's only going to have so many opportunities to be in front of the population and really explain to them why it is they need to turn out for him and for the people that are his proxies on the ballot in November, he didn't do much of that last night, in my view.
It sounds like we might agree, or at least my initial reaction to this State of the Union address. I expected it to be, or at least was waiting and preparing for it to be quite awful, or at least somewhat insane, kind of unhinged. That was kind of what I was expecting. What we saw was a speech that was relatively normal and relatively less unhinged, in my view at least, for Trump. And I think one of the things that you bring up there is there was a lot that he didn't say, and it seemed that he was actually weaving around all of the things that seemed to be going wrong for him. The economy would be an interesting one. There were some moments where he flat out lied about things, like when he said, prices are coming down, which is just not true.
Not true.
The 18 trillion in foreign investment that didn't really seem to make any sense to me. I don't know where he pulled that number from.
I mean, for me, the 65 million people that he personally saved in India and Pakistan, I mean, were that true, he should be president for life. That's pretty extraordinary. Of course, it's utter bollocks. So, yeah, I mean, it is, to be fair, you're saying it's normal for Trump, and that's a significant caveat.
Yes.
I think that we should try to avoid that caveat because it is still a representative democracy. Look, I mean, the biggest thing he had to respond to was his signature policy for his first year was struck down by the Supreme Court. I've never seen that happen in a State of the Union before. And there the Supreme Court justices are, and people that he appointed voted against his signature policy because it was clearly illegal. And he was told by members of his cabinet, this is illegal, sir. You don't need to do this. You can actually do these tariffs in other ways and you're not going to get hit back. And he refuses to listen. That is uniquely batshit crazy. It's an own goal. And now he's got to deal with the consequences of that. Makes him weaker.
And he seemed quite sheepish about that as well. He seemed quite sheepish about the tariffs. He was mentioning things like the border over and over again, didn't really seem to mention the tariffs at all, which is interesting because, as you say, that is the centerpiece of the policy, and it's the biggest news of the week. I would also love to get your reactions to the tariff policies that we've seen, the decision from the Supreme Court. Now we've got the 10% tariffs. He says he's going to bump it up to 15%.
Right.
As the foreign policy expert, what does this mean for other nations? What does this mean for foreign governments, if anything?
Well, the reason he did not want to do it this way, aside from the fact that he's undisciplined and impatient, is that it gives him maximal, unchecked, unilateral authority to place tariffs on anyone, not only any country, but frankly on pretty much any company, any sector, for whatever reason he chooses, which the president just doesn't have the right to do. Because now he still has tariff authority, and that tariff authority will absolutely allow him to put these tariffs on most of these countries at pretty much the same level, but it is going through an investigative process which allows those countries to then respond. And that process is precisely what Trump wanted to avoid. So it constrains him more. It turns out that the American president is not Xi Jinping. He's not Vladimir Putin. And it's not only because he has midterm elections, though that is one pretty significant component, but it's also because there's an independent judiciary. And even if it's 6-3 conservative, and even if he appointed a bunch of them, it turns out that they actually follow the law as opposed to the president. And he doesn't like that, but it is the reality. And that is good for the corporations. It is good for the markets. And you'll note that when the Supreme Court did its ruling, even though it was an extraordinary and historic ruling, the markets didn't really move. And the reasons they didn't move is because this was well expected and anticipated by those of us that have been following this. You don't have to be brilliant. You just have to be reading to understand that it was never going to be allowed. In fact, the only surprise is whether it was going to be 6-3 or 9-0. 6-3 is not a surprise precisely because we've seen many instances where the law was equally clear against Biden, where it was 6-3 in the other direction. All of these, major questions issues that Biden was pushing up against illegally, and the Supreme Court whacked him down. But the most liberal appointees chose not to align with the majority. That's an unfortunate reality of some degree of politicization of the Supreme Court justices, but ultimately doesn't undermine the institution, in my view.
Final question here. We have to ask you, because while we have you, we rarely get to speak with you on this program. He said he ended 8 wars. That was the claim. And then he listed a bunch of countries. He said he ended wars in Israel and Iran. And then he said he's ended the war in Gaza, but then said it's slightly progressing. I forget his exact language. What do you make of that claim? Is it right? Is it wrong? If so, how wrong?
It's has elements of correctness. Modi refused to give Trump credit for bringing about the ceasefire. In reality, he and his administration, particularly Marco Rubio, also J.D. Vance at the margins, played a significant role, not unilaterally, but played a significant role in helping to get those two sides to ceasefire. It is unfortunate that Modi gave him no credit. It is ludicrous that the Pakistani prime minister says he should get the Peace Prize. But the reality is somewhere in between. Armenia and Azerbaijan, he has advanced the cause of peace, but the two sides were not actually fighting when he got engaged. It's a lot easier to end a war when they're not fighting. The case of Israel and Gaza, I give Trump a lot more credit in resolving that conflict to a degree than under Biden. We actually have a U.S.-led peace plan that got Security Council resolution approval. The Russians and Chinese abstained. Everyone else voted in favor. All of the Gulf states and the countries in the region favored it. Trump facilitated the release of all of the hostages, both living and remains, and has been able to move ahead a ceasefire that has not held perfectly, but has held more or less with humanitarian restrictions of aid now being largely ended. And so we no longer have mass starvation in Gaza. So, frankly, he was lying a lot more dramatically on the economy than he was on foreign policy, in my view. And in some of the places where he hasn't done that well, like Russia, Ukraine, he didn't really mention. I think he got 20 seconds, Russia, Ukraine, because he said he was going to end the war, and he's failed at ending the war. And he's admitted repeatedly that he's failed at ending the war. He's not complete.
792K. It's pretty good.
I think they're getting the better end of the bargain, because if someone from Singapore wins the Olympics, did you know Singapore has mandatory national service similar to Israel? And Singapore is the most religiously diverse nation in the world. And they very definitely decided that we are going to be so prone to ethnic violence with all this religious heterogeneity that we need to get people more focused on the flag. And so they decided to do national service.
I think it's a great move. You also go to jail if you leave gum on the ground. Is that not true?
That's actually not true. It's an offense. But I will tell you this, though. I was in Singapore about a month ago, and you have never seen a guy my age go through his luggage more carefully to make sure that that joint from 2 years ago wasn't floating around in a pocket somewhere.
Has that ever happened to you? You accidentally had some detritus?
Detritus?
Yeah, some leftover paraphernalia.
Detritus? I thought that was some sort of gum disease. I think I saw my periodontist for that. No, I have a very healthy fear of prison, and I don't travel with edibles or I do travel with prostitutes.
Keep in the luggage.
That was dark. Just like the kind of guy who would think Africa is a country, not a continent. That was dark, Ed. No, I don't travel with edibles. No, I lose stuff at TSA. They don't find stuff on me. Although they did pull aside Drew one time when I went to Mexico and brought him with me because I needed, my technical support animal, Drew Burrows, to make sure that I could set up. And they pulled him aside and they basically said he had to pay, a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 to get our equipment back. But that's Mexico. That's just part of what you go through when you go to Mexico. But no, have you ever been caught with drugs, Ed?
No, that wasn't the point of that question. No, I haven't. Thank God. Have you ever been arrested? Have you ever gotten in trouble with the law?
No, I've never been arrested. I have been called several times by people who've been arrested. I'm that guy they call because they assume I'm rich and that I know I have contacts. And so I get those calls from prison. I've had 3 calls from people who've been arrested just in the last, feels like the last year, but it's probably the last 2 years.
Wow, so they want you to bail them out?
Well, unfortunately, I learned this. There's not a whole hell of a lot you can do. What you do is you immediately try and call a lawyer. You go down to the station, and all you can do is provide sort of emotional reassurance and have a lawyer lined up. It depends when it happens. I know way too much about this, which probably speaks to my friend group. But it's mostly stupid shit like DUIs and stuff, but which isn't stupid, which is dangerous. And Africa is a continent, not a country. So, but there's not a hell of a lot you can do other than make sure you've lined up a really good lawyer. But I think people are under the impression like I'm going to show up with a bag full of cash and just spring them or something. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes you can just show up with a bunch of cash and make bail.
Right.
But generally speaking, if you get arrested, what happens is your lawyer says, well, he or she is going to go through the system and it's going to be a few hours or a day. What you don't want is to be in a smaller jurisdiction arrested on a Friday after like 5 p.m. because that means you're not seeing the judge till Monday.
This is good to know. I did not know that if I ever get in trouble with the law, I can hit you up. You won't bail me out, but you'll offer some emotional reassurance and line up a lawyer, which is all I need. That's great.
I'm going to come up with nicknames for your prison name and just make fun of you.
Honestly,
White bread.
That would be great.
White bread.
White bread.
Tasty Ed. Tasty Ed.
All right. Shall we get into our conversation with Professor Aswath Damodaran?
We should.
Let's do it. All right. Here is our conversation with Professor Aswath Damodaran, the Kirshner Family Chair in Finance Education and Professor of Finance at NYU Stern School of Business. Professor Damodaran, thank you for joining us once again on Prof G Markets.
Thank you for having me.
So last time you came on, it was probably our biggest episode of the year. It was striking to both me and Scott. It was striking to our audience. A lot of people were writing about it. A lot of people were talking about it because your view was that valuations across the board were too high. And you told us that there was no place to hide in stocks. That was how you framed it. And we had a wide-ranging conversation. And one of the conclusions that you put forward is that perhaps, the traditional wisdom in stock market investing was maybe not as true anymore, at least not right now. Based on valuations, you were looking at getting into collectibles. How has your position changed or not changed since we last spoke? Do you still believe that there is no place to hide in stocks?
If you look at the level of the S&P 500, the time that we talked in, I think, early November, it's about the same level as it's today. The market's kind of flat. And it's, we've had up days and down days. You've had periods of crisis. Here's my biggest issue. One is if this were the equity risk premiums that we're seeing in the market, what people are pricing stocks to earn, is roughly what they were pricing in 2005, 2006, 2004, going back in history. And I think that if you just looked at the numbers, there are ways you can justify it. You can say, oh, what's the big deal? The real issue that you face is, I think the potential for catastrophic changes is much greater now than perhaps at any time in the last 70 years. Catastrophic changes in what way? I mean, after the Second World War, we put together an economic order centered around the U.S. and the U.S. dollar, and that's coming apart. You can see an acceptance that it's coming apart. You saw it last week in the political discussions you saw in Europe about where are we going next. But clearly, now the old system is coming apart. There's nothing to replace it. That's where the catastrophic risk component comes in. And the market seems to essentially be blowing by, saying, it doesn't matter. We're going to figure out a way. And just like we did on COVID, and maybe that's part of what's going on here, is people are saying markets are resilient enough. They're going to find a way, even through this dramatic change in how the global economy is run, to find the other side. And I think that what investors don't seem to be factoring in is there are going to be pitfalls along the way that have to get priced in. So my concern with stocks is not the 1999 level of concern, which is, hey, stocks are crazy. You can't justify this pricing. It is, we can justify the pricing if you assume that there's no catastrophic risk to worry about. But if you do bring in catastrophic risk, then the market becomes worrisome across the board. Whether it's Mag 7, not Mag 7, global equities, US equities, collectively, there seems to be too much of an acceptance that we'll figure a way through this without serious pain.
I'm already feeling bearish again. So I guess one thing I would push back on, it sounds like what you're describing is a collapse in the global order, the way the global economy is set up. Which to me sounds like a US problem.
I don't think so, Ed, and here's why.
No?
Right?
Okay.
I mean, the US has benefited from the world economic order, but so has much of the rest of the world. Europe has lived in the reflected protection of the US for 70 years and essentially been able to focus entirely on economy building, leaving defense and the expense of defending Europe to the US. So this is not just a US problem. The US might have more to lose than everybody else because it's been at the center of the post-World War II economic order. But it's not just the US. I have a feeling that this is going to be pain that percolates in every direction. That this adjustment, it's not so much a collapse, but there's got to be a new economic order that comes out of this. Right. How we get from where we are now to that new economic order is what we should be thinking about. And I don't think it's going to be as painless and as easy as markets seem to be pricing in. I mean, how do you go from the US dollar as the central currency to something else? Because there's nothing else out there right now that can replace the US dollar as a global currency. So I think that transition, more than a collapse, is what's going to be painful because there are going to be some businesses that are going to find a way to get to the other side easily, and other businesses are going to struggle more. But I think that struggle's got to be priced in more, and whether that means a correction of 10%, 20%, 25%, we can debate. Because I think that correction has to occur somewhere along the way as this transition plays out.
Do you think that the correction will be a function of a slowdown in the fundamentals of businesses all across the board, or is it more of a sentiment multiple problem that you're describing? Because the reason I bring this up is I feel as though a lot of investors in the markets are beginning to feel this. We're seeing this, we saw it at Davos. As you say, most people agree something about the world order is changing. We're seeing a lot more attention being paid to the deficit spending in the US. And we did see a rotation in terms of capital flows last year out of the US, or maybe out of the US is actually too harsh, but because the S&P did rise. But ultimately, every other market besides the US saw big returns. Emerging markets up more than 30%. The world minus US ETF up 30% as well. To me, it almost seems as though one response from investors would just be, okay, let's just shift our capital allocation out of the US, invest a little bit more in Europe, invest a little bit more in Latin America. I don't see how this necessarily means that everyone's going to pull back wholesale.
It's not just a rotation in geopolitics, it's a rotation in business economics as well, which is, and you're seeing this with the talk of AI and technology changing businesses. And here's the conundrum that investors face. If it were purely a geographical shift, you're saying, let's shift out of the US, that's our problem. We're over-investing in the US, let's invest elsewhere. But the problem is the businesses that are best positioned to take advantage of the business transformation happen to be US companies. So if you're going to rotate out of the US, and by the extension, you're going to rotate out of technology and the big technological disruptors in the US, I don't see how you maintain balance. So that's why I don't think it's going to be last year, as you pointed out. The S&P 500 did well. The rest of the world did better, but much of that better came from the dollar becoming weaker, not from those markets delivering higher local currency returns. So in fact, I computed the local currency returns and the dollar returns. The dollar returns are much more impressive because you get that extra 9-10% boost in your returns if you're a European stock market, if you build in the dollar depreciation. So I do think we're going to continue to see some weakness in the dollar translating into money moving out of the U.S., but there are limits to how much you can move out of the U.S. without ending up being underinvested in the businesses that are best positioned to take advantage of the economic change. I mean, again, I don't mean to sound catastrophic, but I'm saying, put on your seatbelts because there are going to be adjustments. And the question you asked about fundamentals and perceptions is a good one. And I'll take one sector where you're seeing this play out. Let's take software. If you look at the margins for software last year, they stayed impressive. The gross margins were 75%. They look very much like the previous year. Revenue growth was pretty good. But clearly the perception has changed. Software stocks are down 25 to 30% because there's a concern that AI is going to eat away at margins. And I think it's well placed. Collectively, I think software is ripe for disruption because it's so fat. So many layers of profits you can go after. But I think that when you get those corrections, you're often going to get across-the-board corrections. The perception is going to mean marking down the price of all software companies. But some of them are going to find a way through this disruption to emerge as winners. So I think the same process is going to play out at the market-wide level, which is you're going to see sell-offs, and then you're going to see people re-examining some companies saying, hey, these companies are going to find a way in the new economic structure to be successes. So that's why it's going to be a back and forth. It's not going to be a one-way adjustment where everything gets marked down, we stay down. It's going to be a process where markets are learning, even as as things are unfolding, what this process is going to do to company profits.
So, Aswath, let's double click on that. You've seen some of the most iconic software firms off 30, 40%, and as a multiple on free cash flow, they're trading at some of them at all-time lows. And Ed's thesis, and I think I agree with him, is that it might be a buying opportunity. Because when I look at if I think of their integration into businesses, there's the tip of the iceberg is, all right, what can be done using AI now? But below the surface is they have billing set up, they have UI, they have relationships with the company. I can't even imagine, even my last company, L2, we used Salesforce to track our leads. The idea of getting just a sales team of 5 or 6 people to retrain them on another product, I don't care if it was 50% less expensive, we wouldn't have done it. So is this an opportunity? Have these companies been oversold? The Adobes, the ServiceNows, the Salesforces?
I think collectively, yes. And I think that almost always happens when you have worries about a catastrophe. I mean, I think back 15 years when fossil fuel stocks went into free fall. This was in the early years of ESG and COPE, where people thought, hey, this is the end for fossil fuels. And they went into free fall. And then eventually they recovered because it turned out that the threat was not to a core business. The fossil fuels were still required. I agree with you that the Salesforces of the world and the Oracles are much more sticky businesses than we let on. So if you look at them, the software is only a small piece of the puzzle. It's actually the least, of all the competitive modes, it's the least of their modes. You could probably replicate their software pretty easily. But once they get adopted, they squirrel their way, if that's the right word, into your systems, your data, your processes, and they become part of your company. So it's not just replacing software, it's an entire system. Here's how I think it's going to play out. And I think this is where the software companies are looking. The problem is much of what they do now with people, which is what the expensive part is to track these processes, can be done by AI. And they're offering AI products that effectively do what their regular products are doing. But I think one of the mistakes they're making is what brick and mortar retail firms initially made with online retail, which is they worry about cannibalization. So they can't go in full force with an AI product, even if it's a really good one, the same way that somebody who has nothing to lose can go in. So I think what you're looking for as an investor is which of these companies are using AI in a way that they're willing to give up their existing product sales and replace them with AI. Those companies will make it. And which of the companies won't have their cake and eat it too, which is sell their existing products, charge the prices they do, get the high margins, and offer AI as a side product, but they're not willing to jump in. So I think that the adaptable companies in this mix will be the ones that make it. As an investor, you're looking to see how they're incorporating AI into their product mix and into their business. My prediction is the first thing that's going to get hit in software is not the revenue number. It's going to be the margin number. You're going to see margins come down even at the companies that survive. And it's been a long, great run for software. I mean, I invested in software in the 1980s when it was first coming out. It's been 40 years of really great margins. And I think that in many ways, like every other business that gets disrupted, there'll be a new steady state of lower margins, perhaps greater scale with AI, things that you could not do with traditional software. And some companies are going to navigate that divide better than others. I mean, I think the B2B companies have to be more wary because costs are going to drive a lot of choices. B2C companies, I mean, I own Adobe and I will hold on to Adobe even through the down days because I think it is a more robust software model because of what it does. I could be completely wrong, but I think we need to, you're right. I think right now it's a broad brush. All software companies are getting sold off. But I think that I would track not just what these companies deliver as earnings, because that might be too late to get the signal, but what they're doing in terms of product mix. And given that this requires talking to customers, the more you can talk to people who buy their products and services and ask, what are they offering with AI? What's different? How's the pricing of their AI products? Will give you some insight into which of these companies are going to come out as successes from this and which of these companies are going to falter and fail.
It strikes me that they're just going to come under pricing pressure. And if you think of 10 or 20% of their expenses are related to people who have a CS degree from Carnegie Mellon actually building the product with software, what's to say that they won't be able to reduce that expense internally, pass on the savings to their clients while protecting their margins? Because as someone who's sat on boards of software companies, and software has been the gift that keeps on giving, like we're going to grow our revenues 11%, and we're going to grow our employment 8% and our EBITDA 12 to 15%. That's generally the story of software for the last 30 years. My thesis is there are so many fatty deposits that can be easily taken out of these software companies and they can pass those savings on. While it might be a hit to their top line, like you said, I think their margins and their cash flows, it just strikes me, the last time we spoke to you, we had a difficult time zeroing in on what felt like a buying opportunity. And our thesis has been that if you were to buy a basket of these software companies that have shed, $500 billion to $1 trillion, it feels like the first buy signal in a while.
I think what you're describing is what I would call an adaptable software company. You're saying the software companies that adapt to this, adjust their cost structures quickly, might be able to keep their margins high. And that's a plausible pathway. But we've been around organizations that have to downsize. This is a very different game for them than the game they've been playing. And some of them, I think, are incapable of playing the downsizing game very well because they're just not used to it. So maybe the things to watch is which software companies respond quickly and start reducing their workforces, adjusting their costs. And you're going to start to get that information pretty quickly. And those will be the companies rather than a basket of alts. So maybe we need to create a basket of software companies where their operating expenses have dropped by 10% in the last 2 quarters. That might be a better basket to focus on than basket of all software companies. Because I remember writing about disruption 20 years ago, and I said, look, if you want a perfect target for a disruption, you want to pick a company with high margins It's incredibly slow to respond to change because they keep. I mean, we've seen. I mean, we're in a business, education, where you see how slow change is. If software were run like education, then we can safely predict that software would crash and burn. That in a year or 2 or 3 years from now, there'd be no business. I do think that the more inflexible you are as a company, the less you learn from what's happening around you, the more danger you're exposed to. So rather than buy an entire software basket, I would look at a subset of software companies where you're looking at adaptability, how quickly they're adjusting to costs and adjusting their cost structure down.
On two companies, the two biggest LLMs, Anthropic and OpenAI, which I would argue are technically public companies. You can buy shares in the secondary market. I believe Anthropic's raising at $350. OpenAI, I believe, is trying to close around at $850. Yeah, I'm curious what you think of those respective valuations on the companies. And our thesis has been that Anthropic is actually, I don't want to call it underpriced, but we think that there's going to be a flip in valuation, that Anthropic has more momentum, more enterprise, and that OpenAI is a bit more consumer, more vulnerable, and quite frankly, it's just endured a lot of negative PR, which feels like negative momentum. Have you looked at either or both of these companies and the respective valuations?
I think I'd pick Anthropic purely based on the ego of the people running the company. This is a space where I think if you have smart, egotistical people running the company, you're in danger because they're going to overplay their cards. And with Sam Altman, my feeling is he might be a smart guy. He might have a good set of cards, but he's always going to overplay those cards because he believes his cards are better than they truly are. So from a purely, because this is going to be a space where you require managers, again, the adaptable word comes in, to learn from what's going on and change the way they behave. I'm not sure OpenAI is capable of that learning and change that Anthropic is. I mean, I find, to be quite honest, from an intrinsic value standpoint, I would be hard-pressed to invest in any of these companies at the existing pricing because collectively the pricing just seems too rich to me. But on a relative basis, if you need an LLM in your portfolio, you're much better off with, Anthropic is lucky in terms of who it competes against. OpenAI, basically you can go down the list and it, given its, that peer group, it might be the best of the LLMs to have in your portfolio if you want one in your portfolio. I'm not particularly eager to have any of them in my portfolio. So for me, they all look pretty richly priced. But if you force me, I'd pick Anthropic over OpenAI.
One thing that's so interesting about this dynamic is the fact that they are both private, which seems like a setup that we've never really had before. The idea that the two largest names in the largest, hottest space in the world are not publicly traded.
Are you bringing an XAI into the mix as well?
And XAI would be another example as well. And I think one thing that has been kind of frustrating for me as someone who follows the markets as an investor as well, we saw this gigantic destruction in value in software as a result of these AI tools. $2 trillion in market value just erased over the past couple of weeks because the idea is Anthropic's going to change the game, OpenAI is going to change the game. And yet I haven't been able to see how those stock prices are moving. I mean, presumably you'd think, okay, well then did the $2 trillion just get transferred to OpenAI and Anthropic? Is that what's happening? But I don't know because they're private. So I'd be interested to hear your views on how new this is and how this changes the dynamics of being an investor when we're seeing one of the largest technological revolutions in a really long time.
This is a process that's been unfolding for 20 years now. This private market, a gray market almost, not quite public, not quite private, where you get public market investors invest. I think of Uber raising, when it was $65 billion, raising money from Fidelity and T. Rowe Price and the Saudi Investment Fund, effectively looking like a public company on many dimensions, but staying private. The problem with staying private is there might be pricing out there, but it's often stale and it'll often lag the real world. It would be nice to observe what the LLMs are being priced at, but I think there's your initial lead-in, I think, was a very critical one. You talked about value destroyed in one business and a value created in another one. And one of my problems with the AI pitch for much of the last 2 years was, hey, look at all the good stuff that will come from AI. We gave the market the benefits of all the good stuff that came from AI. We pushed the market up. But nobody seemed to be talking about the disrupted and what it would mean for them. So software, in my view, is the first card to be dealt out of that deck. And there'll be other cards that come. I mean, how much is Accenture going to be worth when AI becomes as powerful as people? If AI advocates are right about what it can do, there are a whole host of other businesses that are ripe for disruption, just like software is. So I think this might just be the opening lead-in into a play where we see what happens to the disrupted. The disruptors are off the market, so that's not good for the overall public equity market, because if the disrupted show up as a decline in public equity value and the private companies are not part of the public equity market, the index has to reflect that loss, but it won't reflect the gain. So if nothing else, for the health of the equity market, you're hoping that these companies go public, because then at least you can get a more complete accounting for both the pluses and the minuses.
Yeah, I mean, when these moments like what we saw in software occur, our view, at least on this podcast, my view has been this is when you want to start getting active in the markets, because it seems as though there is so much uncertainty, there's so much confusion, so much fear about what may happen that people kind of throw their models out of the window and they kind of, more simply speaking, they act a little bit less rationally. They're not projecting cash flows in the way that they were in the past, because they're just so frightened about what may be or what may not be. And to me, those seem like the moments where you want to buy. And that's what I did, by the way. But also in my head is your voice saying that actually the whole thing is overvalued, that there's another layer of risk, another layer of catastrophe that isn't being acknowledged, that isn't being priced in yet, which makes me think, well, am I thinking too small here? Am I making a mistake by looking just at software? Should I be looking at the entire world and the fact that there is an entire global order that could collapse here? And what might that do to valuations?
You can have your cake and eat it too, Ed. You can buy software and sell short on the index if that is what you're concerned about. If you feel confident enough that your picks net are going to be good picks after correcting for the market risk. So that possibility exists, but it is costly to do it. Buying insurance against market collapses is always costly. But if that concern becomes large enough that it's getting in the way of you investing, then my suggestion is buy those stocks in this disruption that you think are being beaten up too much, and buy protection against a market correction at the same time. And that's a possibility that didn't exist 40 years ago, that you can do relatively easily today. So I think there's a way you can do this, but then you're going to be giving up some of your upside if markets continue to go up. And, but it'll give you that self-assurance of, hey, I did the right thing. I'm going to win on my winners, but the market is not going to take me down, even though I was right on the companies that I picked. Now, I think that you're right about the uncertainty issue. I do a session on uncertainty where I talk about the most common reactions human beings have, investors by extension have. The first is denial, which is you say, what uncertainty? I don't see any uncertainty. The second is mental accounting, which is you do something that worked for you 7 years ago in another uncertain setting. It's completely different, but you do it anyway. The third is outsourcing. What do? You ask McKinsey what to do. You ask Goldman Sachs what to do. Now, which is what a lot of people are doing with AI. I have no idea. As if the Goldman Sachs AI analyst has some special insight. And the fourth and the oldest response to uncertainty is you get down on your knees, you look up to the heavens, and say, please, God, tell me where to invest. I think that those are things that people do all the time. But I do agree with you that it's during uncertainty that the payoff to being systematic, to trying to do your homework is greatest, because that's when market mistakes explode. So whether it's software in this first round or something else in the second round, I would look at the sector and then start to go through the sector and start to separate the adaptable from the non-adaptable, because there will be companies that get through this and come out not just intact, but perhaps as winners, because you'll have fewer players left in the game. They'll have less competition after this thing plays out. So I agree with you on that, but it's not for the faint of heart. It is going to come with a lot of ups and downs, more downs initially than ups. I describe investing as an act of faith. Faith that you're right about your assessment of value, and faith that the markets will adjust your value. Faith because if you ask me to prove that a particular software company is cheap, I can't do it. And if you ask me to prove that even if it's cheap, that the price will adjust to that value that you got, I can't prove that either. Investing is all about faith, and your faith will be tested. Might as well be open and honest about the fact. Anybody who claims that they have absolute certainty that software is undervalued, they're jumping in. I have zero interest in following. This is not a space where you can be absolutely sure about anything. You're going to be wrong, and you have to be willing to admit when you're wrong. And that's the other thing I'd build into your investment philosophy. What are the things you're going to track to see if your investment bet is playing off? So maybe layoffs are the thing you want to track. And if the company that you're doing acts like nothing's happening, it's in denial, maybe no matter how good it looked to you at the initial round, you might say, that's not the company I wanted. So being willing to say I was wrong and go back and revisit the company you picked might be an integral part of the strategy working for you in the long term.
On the catastrophic risk that you feel that it is underpriced right now, or that the investors are not paying enough attention to, what are some data points or signals or events that have led you to believe in this notion that there are greater risks than we really understand?
I'm going to give you a strange answer. I've never been one to track the price of gold and silver. And last year was a phenomenally good year for gold and silver. Gold was up almost 70%, silver was up 150%. But what made it so unusual was gold and silver usually go up either during periods of hyperinflation, not just high inflation, but hyperinflation, 1970s, or during severe market crises where markets are down 30, 40%. Neither was true in 2025. So you're saying, why did they go up? There's a segment of the market that has always been into the gold and silver. They form the base of the market. They hold gold and silver, and that's